Hello, my clinic review friends. Today we're going to be doing ABG practice. I have done another video teaching you ROME, respiratory opposite, metabolic equal, but I'm going to review it quickly at the beginning of this video, and then we're going to practice our ABGs using that strategy. And we're even going to do compensated and partially compensated, which is not easy. So stay tuned for those coming right up. Hello, Clinic Review families. Dr. Sharon with Clinic Reviews, the home of the very best NCLEX review in the entire universe, in my opinion. And Mark Klimek does those. You can get them on demand at Clinic Reviews. We also do small group tutoring, and we do streaming service where you can get all of our videos, not the NCLEX review ones, but all of our other videos with no commercials for under $20 a month. So let's go ahead and get started. I like doing this, and I like doing it because it's fun to see how easy ABGs are when you learn this strategy. So that's why I like doing it. So first of all, you do need to know the normal values. Okay, so pH is 735 to 745, and this gives an indicator of acid-base balance. The PaO2, it's millimeters of mercury. That's between 80 and 100. This gives you an indication of oxygenation. And if they're going into respiratory failure, the PaCO2 is between 35 and 45. That tells you carbon dioxide. It's either, they can say hyper or hypocapnia, so low or high carbon dioxide. And it tells you if they're going into respiratory failure, because gas exchange is the purpose of the lungs. The lungs have one job, and that's to exchange gases. And if they're not exchanging gases appropriately, then they are starting to develop respiratory insufficiency, which can lead to respiratory failure. And then there's the bicarb, which is between 22 and 26, and that's acid-base balance. So when they ask you an acid-base balance question, you really only have to look at the pH and the bicarb, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about. So ROME is respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So respiratory opposite means the pH and the bicarb are going in opposite directions. Metabolic equal means the pH and the bicarb are going in the same direction, either up, or both down, whereas respiratory opposite means pH is up, bicarb is down, or pH is down, bicarb is up. So respiratory opposite, you see a pH is down 7.29 and the bicarb is up at 31. And that means even if you don't see the CO2 or the O2, you go, that's respiratory acidosis, because respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So how do you get to respiratory acidosis? Well, you have opposite pH and bicarb, and the pH is down. So it's got to be acidosis. It can't be alkalosis. The pH is down. So it has to be respiratory acidosis. And then another example here, the pH is up and the bicarb is down. So we know it's respiratory as opposed to metabolic. So you cross off all those metabolic options and you say, okay, I know it's respiratory, but which respiratory is it? Well, if the pH is up, then it has to be respiratory or respiratory alkalosis. Then metabolic is equal. That means the pH and the bicarb are both going in the same direction. I don't know why I said 7.45 there, because 7.45 is normal. So let's pretend it says 7.47. Okay, 745 is normal. Let's say 747. And the bicarb is up. So we know it has to be metabolic. But if it's 747, let's see, did I change it? No, I didn't. Okay, so if the pH, will say it's 747, right? Because I messed up. 747 is up. That's alkalosis, and bicarb is up. So it's metabolic. So it's metabolic alkalosis. And then here we have a pH that's down and the bicarb is down. So it has to be metabolic. So that means you cross off your respiratory options and you say, well, it has to be metabolic. Well, which metabolic is it? The pH is down. So it has to be metabolic acidosis. Okay. So that's just a quick review of metabolic of ROME, respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. I do have another ABG video if you're interested in that. So let's do some questions, y'all. Okay, let's do some questions. A patient's ABG results are as follows. The pH is 748, PaO2 88, PaCO2 is 32, the bicarb is 21. Which of the following conditions is most consistent with these results? Y'all, even if they give you the O2 and the CO2, you don't have to look at them. You only have to look at the pH and the bicarb. And the pH is up and the bicarb is down because the bicarb's 22 to 26, right? So we know that this has to be an alkalosis answer. So it either has to be C or D because the pH is up, but they're going in the opposite direction, which is respiratory. Respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So it's a respiratory alkalosis, y'all. Okay, respiratory alkalosis. A patient presents with the following ABG results: pH 732, PaO2 78, PaCO2 50, bicarb of 29. So this is an acid-based question because all the answers are acid-based answers. There's no respiratory failure option here, okay? And it wouldn't be respiratory failure anyway, it'd be respiratory insufficiency. But either way, these are all acid-based questions. So we only have to look at the pH and the bicarb, and the pH is down and the bicarb is up. So they're respiratory opposite. They're going in the opposite direction. So I can cross off A and C. No, I'm sorry. I can cross off A and D because those are my metabolic answers. So it has to be a respiratory answer. Well, which one is it? The pH is down. So it has to be respiratory acidosis. Don't make this more difficult than you have to. A patient has an ABG with the following values: pH 729, PaO2 88, PaCO2 38, bicarb of 18. Which condition do these results indicate? And they're all acid-based answers. So when I'm going to worry about the PO2 and the PCO2, okay? So the pH is down and the bicarb is down. So they're both going in the same direction, respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So it has to be a metabolic answer. So A and C are going to get crossed off. It has to be either B or D, and the pH is down, so it has to be metabolic acidosis. A patient with ABG results are as follows: pH 75, PaO2 85, PaCO2 40, bicarb 30. What is the likely diagnosis? All the answers are acid-based answers. So it has to be an acid-based question. So we're going to not even look at the O2 or the CO2. We're just going to look at the pH and the bicarb. Here the pH is up and the bicarb is up because the bicarb is 22 to 26. So respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. They're both going in the same direction. So it's a metabolic answer. So I can cross off A and B because those are respiratory answers. So it's a metabolic answer. The pH is up. So it has to be metabolic alkalosis. So let's look at this a little bit different way. This is a more difficult way of looking at this. You can still figure it out, and I want to show you how you can do that. Which of the following ABG results would you expect to see in a patient who's hyperventilating due to anxiety? All right. Hyperventilating due to anxiety. Well, it has to be respiratory. It can't be metabolic. Okay? It can't be metabolic because it's a respiratory problem. If they tell you it's a respiratory problem, y'all, pick a respiratory answer. Okay? So let's see which of these results is respiratory. Well, the first one has a low pH and a low bicarb. Low pH and low bicarb. So that has to be metabolic acidosis because it's the same direction. Respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. It's the same direction. And it's acidosis. So it can't be A. The second one has a high pH and a low bicarb. Okay, so that's respiratory alkalosis because the pH is up and the respiratory opposite, the pH and the bicarb in opposite direction. So that's respiratory alkalosis. The third one, the pH is down, so we know it's acidosis. And the bicarb is up, so it's going in the opposite direction. So that's a respiratory acidosis. And then the last one, the pH is up and the bicarb is up. So that's a metabolic alkalosis. So remember I told you this has to be a respiratory answer. So we're going to cross off A and D because those are our metabolic answers. So we're not even going to consider them. So now we're going to look at the PaCO2. I don't normally look at the PaCO2, but in this case I have to because I have two respiratory answers and I say to myself, is it going to be alkalosis or is it going to be acidosis? Hyperventilating, you're blowing off more CO2, right? Hyperventilating, you're blowing off CO2. So would you expect the CO2 to be high or low? Well, you would expect the CO2 to be low because you're hyperventilating. And if you're hyperventilating and blowing off CO2, it makes sense that the pH would go up. So I like the answer that has the low CO2. Okay, because that tells me, yeah, I'm blowing off more CO2, so my pH would go up. That makes sense. So my answer is respiratory alkalosis. Now, if you have an easier way to get to this answer, you use it. Okay, you use the easier answer that you have. What I'm telling you is that this is how I would have to get to this answer. And you be using my whiteboard. If I'm taking the NCLEX, I'd be using my whiteboard and I'd be writing A is metabolic acidosis, B is respiratory alkalosis, C is respiratory acidosis, D is metabolic alkalosis. And I'd go, okay, which they're hyperventilating, so blowing off CO2. So I go B, the low CO2. So I'm picking B. And it makes sense to me. I would have to work through it like that. Y'all, I don't have tricks in my head. And I know there's like this tic-tac-toe thing, y'all. That kind of stuff just doesn't work for me. If it works for you, that's awesome. Totally use whatever tic-tac-toe way you learned. Okay. A patient's ABG shows the following: pH is 731, bicarb of 52, and CO2 of 52 and a bicarb of 28. The nurse interprets this as which of the following? So it has to be, so I look at my answers, uncompensated or compensated. So the question I'm going to ask first, because I like to rule out answers. The first question I've got to ask myself is, could this be compensated? Is it possible that this is compensated? Y'all, the pH is low. Never, never, never choose compensated when the pH is low. Never. Okay. So I'm going to cross off my compensated options and not even consider them. So I'm just going to use my usual respiratory opposite metabolic equal. So in this case, I have a low pH and a high bicarb. So I know it has to be one of the respiratory answers. And because the pH is low, it has to be respiratory acidosis. So I've already crossed off B because I'm not going to choose compensated. So it has to be uncompensated respiratory acidosis. I don't know if they will use the word uncompensated for you on the NCLEX. They may use it on some of your exit exams that you use, but uncompensated respiratory acidosis is a redundant sentence or set of words, because if it's respiratory acidosis, by definition, it is uncompensated. Compensation is all about the pH. If you say it's compensated, the pH must be within normal limits. A patient has the following ABG results: pH 737, CO2 47, bicarb 28. What do these values indicate? So I have various acid-base imbalances, and then I have partially compensated and fully compensated. So I like to cross off answers that I know can't be right. Y'all, I have a pH that's within normal limits. I have a pH that's within normal limits. It cannot be partially compensated. It has to be fully compensated. A pH within compensation is all about the pH. We die when our pH is low or high. That's when we die. So if our body on its own can get the pH back to normal, it's like, yay, we're compensating. Okay. So I have to cross off A and D. I have to cross off A and D because it can't be partially compensated. So it has to be fully compensated. So the question is it respiratory acidosis or metabolic acidosis? Because we have a pH that's on the low end of normal. The pH is on the low end of normal, but the bicarb is high. So if I were to say, is it opposite or equal, right? Because the pH is on that's why I put an angled down arrow. So even though it's within normal limits, it's angled down because it's on the low end of normal, but the bicarb is high. And when you have opposite, what do you say? You say respiratory, right? So even though it's within normal limits, it's on the low end and the bicarb is high. So I'm going to say it's respiratory, fully compensated respiratory acidosis. So to look at fully compensated questions, you can still look and use respiratory opposite metabolic equal. You just have to consider which end of the normal is it on? Is it on the low end of normal, the high end of normal? A patient with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease has an ABG result of pH 735, CO2 55, bicarb 30. What does this indicate? And we have both fully compensated and partially compensated. So the pH is within normal limits. So I'm crossing off partially compensated. It cannot be partially compensated when the pH is normal. And don't say, well, it's really close to abnormal. That's true. It's really close to abnormal, y'all, but it's still with the normal limits. So it's normal. You can't say it's close to normal. You say it's normal. That's what you have to say. Okay. So it's within normal limits. So I'm crossing off partially compensated. So is it metabolic? This time it's alkalosis or respiratory acidosis. Well, I think it's highly unlikely that it's metabolic alkalosis because the pH is on the low end of normal. But if we say that the pH is on the low end of normal, the bicarb is high. So I'm going to say, well, that's still opposite. So it has to be compensated respiratory acidosis. It has to be. So fully compensated are, if you're not going to get a standard ABG where you have like acidosis or alkalosis, where you use respiratory opposite metabolic equal, the second most easy type of question to get is the fully compensated ones, because the fully compensated ones, you only choose that when you have a normal pH. So at least you can get it down to the 2. And then you look at the pH and say, well, is it down low end of normal or high end of normal? Which one is it? And then you look at the bicarb and you still can use Rome. All right, y'all, this is the hardest kind. If you get a partial compensated question on NCLEX, you're doing extremely well. You don't have to get them right to pass, okay? But I know people are like, well, how do I know partial compensation? So I'm gonna work through it with you, y'all, and I have to think through it. There's no trick I have for you to help you with this, okay? So which of the following ABG results suggest metabolic acidosis with partial compensation? Well, first of all, partial compensation means the ABG is still abnormal. The ABG is still abnormal because full compensation means the pH is normal. So if the ABG still has to be abnormal, then I can cross off the ones where it's normal. The problem is they're all abnormal. So this is a hard one, y'all. This is a hard question. So now I'm going to have to go through each one and say what's what here, okay? So the partial compensation. So I'm looking for an abnormal one. So the pH in A is down. The pH is up in B. It's down in C, and it's up in D. So we're looking for acidosis. So I can cross off anything where the pH is high. Okay. So I'm going to cross off B and D because those have a high pH. So there's no way it can be metabolic acidosis. It just can't be. Has to be either A or C. So now I'm going to look at the bicarb. Okay. Okay. This is interesting because both of them have low bicarbs. So both of them are metabolic acidosis. Both of these are metabolic acidosis, but only one of them is partially compensated. Only one of them is partially compensated. And the one that's partially compensated is the one that also has an abnormal CO2. So partial compensation is when all 3 of these are abnormal. All 3 of these are abnormal. Now you can remember partial compensation is when all 3 are abnormal, or you can do it like I did it, where you kind of go through it and you go, okay, what's going on here? What's going on? Okay. So because what I might have seen is one of them might have had a high bicarb. If one of them had had a high bicarb, then I would have gone, oh, that's respiratory acidosis. That can't be the right answer. But this was a really hard one because they gave me 2 metabolic acidosis, but only one of them was partially compensated because the PaCO2 was also abnormal. So the body was trying to compensate by blowing off more CO2, but it wasn't working. We still had a low pH. A patient with uncontrolled diabetes presents with an ABG showing a pH of 7.25, a PaCO2 of 30, and a bicarb of 15. What is the most likely diagnosis? Okay, well, let's evaluate this first. So first of all, I'm going to say, well, the pH is low and the bicarb is low. So it has to be metabolic because it's equal. They're both down. And the pH is low, so it has to be metabolic acidosis. So I can cross off anything that's not metabolic acidosis, y'all. And look at that. There's only one that's metabolic acidosis. So you can say, well, is it really respiratory compensation? Well, the PaCO2 is low, so it is respiratory compensation. But you can get this right without even knowing it's respiratory compensation because it's the only answer that has metabolic acidosis in it. Okay. So that is the correct answer. And that is the end of our practice. You may want to watch it a few times. If it were me, I'd be watching it a few times because it takes some practice, which is why I'm giving you a second video on this. So I did the first video a while ago, and I thought maybe some of you would like to have some more practice on ABGs with this and with me. So I hope you find this helpful, and you will get an ABG question on your NCLEX, y'all. So you really do need to be ready for it. You don't have to get partial compensation correct, but if you're getting a partial compensation question, you're probably doing really well. So good luck on your NCLEX, good luck on your exit exams. And if you're coming back to watch me, even though you passed your NCLEX, thank you so much for coming around again. Thanks for being part of the Clinic Review family. Take care.